2,000 years, pictures have told the story. A life, a death, and a birth. This picture is the start of the Jesus story. But what if that picture was wrong?
Many of the details of the nativity that we think of in Western culture aren't even in the gospel stories.
Take away the donkey, the inn, the wise men, and what's left.
The Gospels only inherited the fact that the man was born and who his parents were.
Now, travel back with us as we search for the truth about Jesus' birth.
There are no bright exploding stars at the time that Jesus might have been born.
The real Star of Bethlehem. The real inn.
There's a concept of the inn as being where the people actually slept on the platform, and that the manger could have well been the area below where the animals were kept.
The real pain of a mother in labor.
A woman had about a 25% chance of dying in childbirth.
And the real miracle of Christmas.
What's really remarkable, and maybe even the miracle of the birth story of Jesus, is that he survived.
We all know the tale. A shining star in the east. A desperate search for shelter. In Bethlehem, a newborn in a manger. 3 wise men and their gifts. We've been telling and retelling the story of the birth of Jesus for centuries. People of all faiths recognize this humble nativity scene. Mother and child with shepherds and wise men. More people celebrate Christmas than any other religious event on the planet. The focus of that celebration is here. The town of Bethlehem is at least 3,000 years old. Today, it is a modern city of 28,000 people. In Jesus' time, it was a quiet rural village. A 1,700-year-old tradition claims this is the very spot where Jesus entered the world.
In the 4th century, Constantine the Great's mother, Helena, locates the spot, allegedly, where Jesus is born, which is in a cave in Bethlehem. And on top of that, then, the Church of the Nativity is built, where pilgrims today go to celebrate Jesus' birth on Christmas Day.
But how much of what we think we know about the Nativity is true? The Bible actually says precious little about Jesus' birth.
It's a very interesting thing that only 2 of the 4 Gospels actually address the birth story. The earliest accounts that we have, the Gospel of Mark, didn't think that the birth of Jesus was one of the more important things to say about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
The 2 Gospels that do tell the Nativity story, Matthew and Luke, tell it very differently.
There's a few things that they have in common, such as that it is in Bethlehem and that Jesus is born of a virgin, Mary. But other than that, the details vary substantially.
The Gospel of Luke has Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem to comply with a Roman census.
In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered.
It's a popular image, Mary on a donkey. But the Gospel of Matthew records no such journey. In his Gospel, Joseph and Mary hail from Bethlehem, not Nazareth. Instead, Matthew gives us a different Christmas icon, the Star of Bethlehem.
And there, ahead of them, went the star they had seen in the east.
And the Gospels disagree on who witnessed the birth. Matthew brings in wise men. In Luke, there are only shepherds.
It's very clear that all of that stuff has been laid on by the individual gospel writers, say, for example, the shepherds versus the Magi. I mean, who came and when? There must be a core story that they all inherited. They go to Bethlehem, they have a baby, and there's not much more beyond that core there.
Then there's King Herod's attempt to kill the infant Jesus with the massacre of all children under 2 in Bethlehem. But that infamous story comes only from Matthew and no other gospel. The reality? This familiar nativity scene with wise men and shepherds is nowhere in the Bible.
You have to keep in mind that the first Christians were really concerned about the teachings of Jesus and also about his death and resurrection. And so that the stories of the birth were really secondary. And it's not until a generation later that there's an interest in the birth stories about Jesus.
Most historians don't believe the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. In fact, they date the writing of Matthew and Luke to about 90 years after the birth of Jesus.
There's a couple of problems that Matthew and Luke face when they write down their Gospels. One of them is that the eyewitnesses are slowly dying out, and most of them are no longer around. But the biggest problem is that what separates them from the stories of Jesus' birth is the Jewish war with Rome.
In 70 AD, Roman legions swarmed into Jerusalem.
When the Romans besieged Jerusalem and began to enter various parts of the city, fighting spread onto the top of the Temple Mount, where some of the Jewish rebels had taken refuge. So the Roman army then attacks the Temple Mount, and during the course of the fighting, the temple building is set on fire and burns down.
The temple was the heart of Judaism, the place where God actually lived.
Some of the best evidence for the destruction of the Temple Mount can be seen right behind me, and the size of the stones and the enormous piles of them give you an impression of the devastation caused at the time of the destruction. Everyone was put to the sword. So when Jerusalem fell to the Romans in 70, men, women, and children, whether they were soldiers, rebels, or not, everyone was killed.
Countless thousands of Jews died in the war. Those who survived scattered across the Middle East. The Gospel writers lived in the wake of these events. The chasm of a calamitous century stood between them and Jesus' birth.
So Matthew and Luke really are the first to write the birth stories, and they have no good evidence, and they're grasping at clues just to try to find the basics of the birth story of Jesus.
In fact, the 2 Gospels are so thin on details that much of the nativity story we know comes from later writings, folk tales that never even made it into the Bible.
Mary said to him, "Take me down from the donkey." And he found a cave there and brought her into it.
Many of the details of the Nativity that we think of in Western culture aren't even in the Gospel stories, such as the donkey and the cave. Both of those come actually from the infancy Gospel of James, which is a 2nd or 3rd century text circulated amongst early Christians.
To uncover the real nativity behind the icons, we return to the Holy Land itself. We'll search for a realistic setting for Jesus' birth.
Every step you step on this ground is 1st century Galilee, the time of Jesus.
Recreate village life in Judea and Galilee. And tell the story the Gospels don't.
The real birth process begins at the time that other women are walking the birthing mother around the room. Comfort her, tell her everything will be all right.
Of how Mary may have actually brought Jesus into the world.
Very good.
One icon of the birth of Jesus stands out above the rest, the Star of Bethlehem. Matthew tells us how wise men, presumably astrologers, followed it to find baby Jesus.
Ahead of them went the star that they had seen in the east, until it stopped over the place where the child was.
To some, the star is a heavenly blessing. To others, it offers hope of solving one nativity mystery. When was Jesus born? Back in the 6th century, a Roman monk set the date of Jesus' birth as the year 1 AD. No modern historians believe that. And the evidence comes from the Gospels themselves. Matthew places the birth in the reign of King Herod. Historians agree he died in the year 4 BC. But Luke has Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem because of the Roman census.
In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus.
Augustus made several censuses of his entire empire, but the land of Judea was not technically under direct Roman control until 6 AD, after Herod the Great's son, Archelaus, was deposed. And we know that in 6 AD there was a census of Judea, but that was done by Quirinius, who was the Roman governor of Syria.
Luke even mentions the Syrian governor by name.
This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria.
If Luke is correct, then he pegs the birth of Jesus in 6 AD, a full decade after Matthew does. The Star of Bethlehem could help us figure out which version is right. Today, we can turn back the celestial clock to see the Judean sky as it was 2 millennia ago, and search for a heavenly event that could have caught the eyes of the Magi.
We should read the word star as sign. A sign appeared in the sky. So we should look at the sky the same way the Magi did and try to understand what of the many things happening in the sky was the star.
Modern astronomers have found several candidates. The Chinese recorded what might have been a faint exploding star or nova in the spring of 5 BC.
If there had been a bright exploding star, the case would be closed. We'd say that was the Christmas star. We don't have to look further. But there were no bright exploding stars at the time that we're interested in.
Astronomers know that Halley's Comet passed across the heavens in 12 BC. But that's too early to be a contender, and no other bright comets appeared near this time. What the Magi saw could have been more subtle than a comet or exploding star.
Whatever it was something that only the Magi saw. And that suggested something that required interpretation rather than something that was brilliant, that was dazzling.
Astrologers, past and present, have always focused on the movement of the planets. In 7 BC, the bright planets Jupiter and Saturn would have passed almost on top of one another 3 times in the space of 7 months. Something that happens only once every 900 years. But this is not the most impressive celestial event around the birth of Jesus. Spin forward to June 2 BC, and we find Jupiter moving in on another heavenly partner, Venus.
On the evening of June 17th, as the sky grew dark and the stars appeared, the 2 planets had merged into one single gleaming object, one giant star in the sky, in the direction of Jerusalem, as seen from Persia. And that night, the Magi would have watched in astonishment as these 2 merged planets slowly set in the west.
Is this event in 2 BC the Star of Bethlehem?
You can't pick the most interesting astronomical event and say this was the star, because there are interesting things happening in the sky every year, and so you don't know how to make a choice.
We can't pin down the Star of Bethlehem in the night sky, but that might not be the right place to look.
Right after Julius Caesar is assassinated, his adopted son Octavian, who later becomes Augustus, sponsors a series of games inside Rome, and it's at that time that a comet appears in the sky.
Augustus saw the comet as an omen.
Augustus made the claim when a comet flew across the skies in Rome that that was his father, Julius Caesar, that was his soul taking his place amongst the gods. That was his resurrection, or apotheosis. So he put that star on all of his coins.
Emperor Augustus minted coins with a picture of Julius Caesar on one side and a star on the other. He even began to refer to himself as Divi Filius, the divine son. He spread the message of his divinity all over the empire. Evidence still exists in the ruins of the city of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey.
All across the Roman Empire, the message was spread of the supremacy of the emperor, in fact, of the divinity of the emperor. That message was spread on inscriptions, such as this one here, which reads, Imperator Caesari Divi Filius Augustus, which means Caesar, the son of God, Augustus. And this is the message that Christians challenged with the message that Jesus is the Son of God.
The Star of Bethlehem may have been Matthew's answer to Caesar's comet. If one celestial sign made Augustus the son of a god, another could do the same for Jesus.
What Matthew's trying to say is that no, this poor, lowly Jewish peasant is in fact the Son of God, not this high and mighty Imperial Lord.
Scholars suspect Matthew is trying to make one more historical parallel. Herod the Great's massacre of infants in Bethlehem is a powerful story, but it puzzles historians.
There are a lot of ancient historians that talk about Herod the Great, and one of them is the Jewish historian Josephus, who tells in great detail of some of the maniacal acts of Herod the Great. But the slaughter of the innocents, as recorded in Matthew, is nowhere mentioned in Josephus.
In fact, there's not a shred of evidence to back up Matthew's story. But it helps the gospel writer make another important connection: Jesus and Moses.
For Matthew, Herod very much fulfills the role of Pharaoh. That is, the despotic ruler who tries to stop what God is planning in the world.
Just as in the Old Testament, when the infant Moses escapes the wrath of Pharaoh, Joseph and Mary take the infant Jesus to Egypt to escape Herod.
Well, Matthew wants the reader to make the connection between the first great man of Hebrew history, Moses, and now the great man of Hebrew and Jewish and Christian history, Jesus.
Luke chose a different Jewish hero to measure Jesus against: King David.
David was the shepherd king And by having shepherds at the place of Jesus' birth, Luke's trying to make the point that this is the new shepherd king, the new descendant of David.
There's another link to David in both gospel accounts: the city of Bethlehem, the ancestral home of Israel's greatest king.
In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place.
The prophet Micah said the Messiah would hail from this village.
But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel.
Anybody who wants to picture Jesus as Messiah has to, first of all, believe that he's a Davidic descendant, hence the genealogies that trace him from King David. Second of all, you want him born in Bethlehem, like King David.
But the prophecy is not a neat fit. The baby grows up to be called Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem.
Some would wonder that if he actually was born in Bethlehem, that perhaps that would turn up again later on in the gospel traditions, but it never does.
Coming up, archaeologists search for the true birthplace of Jesus. See what they uncover when Science of the Bible continues. You can't think of the Nativity without thinking of Bethlehem. But the biblical link is not so clear. The Gospels of Mark and John make no mention of where Jesus was born.
I think it's fair to say that the majority of scholars are very skeptical of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem.
Luke and Matthew disagree on whether Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem or whether they always lived there.
What are they doing in Bethlehem? Since there was no census as far as we know at that time, then we have to somehow or another explain why it just happens to be that the home of King David, who is, of course, the prototype for the Messiah, should be the place where a family from Nazareth goes to have its baby. This is a very strange thing.
There's no way to prove where Jesus was born. But can archaeology uncover a realistic setting for the Nativity? There's just one phrase in the Bible that hints at the humble surroundings of Jesus' birth.
She laid him in a manger.
The word manger is derived from the French to eat and means feeding trough. But the Greek word photne, used in the original text, has a more ambiguous meaning.
Normally we see it used to translate a stall, a place where animals are kept. The tradition arose that it referred to the actual feeding trough, or the manger, where the child was placed. But in general, what we're supposed to understand is that this is a very modest and simple place, a place where animals are kept.
But what type of animal shelter did peasants use 2,000 years ago? Bethlehem's Church of the Nativity shows the setting as a cave. Archaeologist Mordechai Aviam found caves next to houses in the ruins of the first-century town of Yodaphat. He believes ancient Galileans chiseled them out of bedrock to make shelter for their animals.
Man-made cave that is large enough to host a small flock of sheep or goats. Caves like this were too wet during the winter to hold any other households, but it is good enough to have some of the livestock of the family.
Around the Middle East, shepherds use caves as stables to this day.
It's a natural cave. You can see it here very simply, walled off on one side with just a door at one end. This would be used as a small dwelling place. A shepherd could keep his sheep in here with him. When you think about the range of possibilities for places where Jesus might have been born, this is at the bottom end of that range. It's the humblest.
But another possible setting for the birth is more likely. The nativity tradition has Mary and Joseph making a desperate attempt to find a place to stay while they travel to Bethlehem. The story comes from another handful of words in the Gospel of Luke.
Because there was no room for them at the inn.
But the word inn may not mean what we think. To understand what Luke means, we need to take a closer look at living quarters in the Middle East. Peter Richardson's special interest is architecture of the ancient world. With reconstruction expert Kim Hicks, he examines a typical rural home that incorporates ancient construction methods.
Wow, what a great example of a two-story house.
It's amazing.
The upper story is clearly the living area. The fireplace is a dead giveaway. The entrance door over here, the plastering.
Timbers went in here for the second layer.
And unplastered down on the lower level where the animals are.
There's an interpretation of the concept of the inn as being where the people actually slept on the platform, and that the manger could have well been the area below where the animals were kept. It's a classic interpretation that would work.
Works very nicely. The animals are here, the people are there.
I think a part of the problem is the popular imagery. Jesus is born in a stable, and in much of modern Western culture, stables are completely separate from houses. They're out there in the barnyard somewhere, and that simply is not the case. There are no separate stables.
The inn Luke mentions may have been the upper living quarters of a split-level peasant house, where animals were kept downstairs in a manger or feeding area. Joseph and Mary could have been at home or on the road. Either way, in the cramped quarters of peasant life, giving birth next to animals would have been nothing unusual.
We're simply dealing with a person being born in a kind of normal peasant house, which was modest, but that's where people were born, at home. If you're an aristocrat, fine, you were born in a fancy house. But if you're not, you were born in this type of a house.
Our goal is to make a faithful portrayal of the birth of a child in Israel 2,000 years ago. We're reconstructing the type of house that once stood in Galilee and Judea.
Well, here's our version of a Galilean home.
Wow, split level.
Split level.
Very nice, yeah, I like it. This is perfectly fair reconstruction speculation.
Well, also,
Kim Hicks has designed a typical peasant house. A single room with no windows.
It has the option of living above on the platform and keeping the animals below, sort of out of your way, and yet convenient and safe at night and locked up and secure.
This small, dark home with mud-plastered walls would be what Joseph and Mary called home. And it's where a child, who would one day be called King of Kings, first saw the light of day. Next, the perils of giving birth in the 1st century. Motherhood may have been joyous. Childbirth was anything but. When Science of the Bible returns. For over 2,000 years, the birth of Jesus has been the subject of spiritual and theological debate. But to a peasant woman whose Aramaic name was Mariam, who lived perhaps in Nazareth or perhaps in Bethlehem, this event was cold and hard reality. She may have looked forward to it with joy, but she would have known all too well she was about to enter a period of great danger.
Death in childbirth was the most common way that a woman died in the ancient world. But producing children was likewise her most important job. A woman had about a 25% chance of dying in childbirth. And most of the maternal deaths are likely caused by infection.
Even if a woman had the good fortune to survive, she still faced the possibility that her baby might not.
My guess is that somewhere between 20 and 25% of babies died within 24 or 48 hours of birth.
In the entire Bible, there is only one line that gives us any hint about Mary's momentous passage into motherhood.
And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth.
But there are other sources of information about first-century childbirth.
One of them is a physician, an obstetrician gynecologist by the name of Cyrannus from the early Christian period. And he gives a description of what a good midwife was expected to do.
Cyrannus's writing allows us to demonstrate what birth might have looked like in a rich Greco-Roman household.
Childbirth in the ancient world was the province of women. Most women gave birth at home.
Female relatives would be close at hand, along with a professional midwife and her assistants. Midwives knew enough to let gravity speed the progress of labor.
Women did not lie down in the ancient world to have babies.
If the woman was lucky, the midwife came equipped with a state-of-the-art birthing stool.
A specially designed chair with a crescent cut out in the seat and handles for the mother to grip to be able to push on her contractions.
But even the richest women would have had little in the way of medical aids.
Soft sea sponges and water, olive oil, ointments for softening the skin around the birth area. This is as good as it got.
But a poor Jewish woman like Mary would have few of the luxuries of a Greco-Roman delivery. Her labor would have been even more daunting. The birth of Jesus would have taken place in humble surroundings, where farmers and shepherds were struggling to survive.
Okay, we're going to try to block out now the actual birth process of Mary.
In our reconstruction of a first-century peasant house, historian Valerie French will attempt to recreate as realistically as possible the manner in which Jesus might have come into the world. Mary would have relied on female relatives and neighbors to help her through the ordeal. They would have followed the rules of daily Jewish life, later written down in the Talmud.
The Talmud says that the real birth process begins at the time that other women are walking the birthing mother around the room, and probably the walking itself speeds delivery.
Men did not normally take part, so Joseph most likely did not witness the birth of Jesus.
Joseph would probably be outside the house, but at a doorway, ready to go and get anything the midwife said that they needed.
It's unlikely the midwife brought a birthing stool. Poor women could not afford these luxuries.
But I think we need to understand that this would be birth in a working class community. And a midwife might not have a birthing stool.
At this critical moment of labor, Mary would have sat on the lap of the midwife's assistants. The midwife would have placed a cloth on the ground so that the newborn's first contact with the world would not be a dirt floor contaminated with animal droppings.
And then the midwife's assistants would be able to push down with the contractions.
Braced against the body of another, Mary pushed. We don't know how long Mary's labor lasted. We can only imagine the relief she felt that first moment she set eyes on her son and heard his first cry. Then the midwife cut Jesus' umbilical cord.
Midwives might use a knife, a sharp piece of glass, or a hard crust of bread. I like the hard crust of bread idea because, in fact, you would only use it once, and that would, in fact, prevent any kind of infection of the umbilical cord. Once the umbilical cord has been cut and tied off, then the midwife does a very thorough examination of the infant.
4 women had helped Mary bring Jesus into the world, but their job was not over.
In the Talmud, it suggests that midwives use fine granulated salt to rub all over the baby's skin and then wash the baby with water.
The gospel writer Luke only returns to the details of the birth story after Mary's labor pangs are over.
She wrapped him in bands of cloth.
It was common practice to tightly bind the bodies of newborns. Jesus was no different.
You had to wrap the legs, the torso, the arms, and sometimes even the head of the baby in these swaddling bands so that the baby's limbs then would grow straight and tall.
After the midwife had swaddled Jesus, she would finally let Joseph in. A moment so universal, parents' first knowledge of their child. This is as close as history and science can get to the actual birth of Jesus. We've stripped away the donkey, the cave, perhaps even Bethlehem itself. The nativity scene is not just inaccurate, it is incomplete. The true story of Christmas did not end with the child in a manger. But with rituals that most Christians would find totally alien. We've painted a new picture of the birth of Jesus. What about our picture of Mary, the Holy Mother? 1,000 years after she lived, church artists had fully transformed Mariam, the peasant woman, into the Virgin Mary, the icon. But even a few decades after Mary's time, the gospel writers saw her as much more than an ordinary woman.
All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son.
The prophecy comes from the book of Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, but the Gospel of Matthew adds one crucial twist.
Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son.
Matthew took from Isaiah the Hebrew word Alma, which means young girl, and translated it into the Greek word Parthenos, which means virgin. The meaning of the prophecy cannot be decided by archaeology, but what we know about Jewish life 2,000 years ago does support Mary being a young woman.
I think we in the modern world tend to look at Mary as someone who is just married, someone who might be 20 or so years old. In antiquity, when you were just married or when you had your first child, you were much younger, so that I would envision Mary being perhaps only 14 or 15 years old when she gives birth to Jesus.
We have to strip away 2,000 years of iconography to replace the Virgin Mary with Miriam, the young Jewish peasant. The real Mary wore the brown or beige of a peasant, not a fine blue robe. And after Jesus was born, the mother of Christianity would almost certainly have performed a ritual most Christians know nothing of. According to Jewish law, the blood of childbirth would have made her ritually impure.
For most kinds of ritual impurity, the Hebrew Bible prescribes that the way to purify yourself is to immerse yourself in a pool of water.
There are remnants of these ritual pools, mikvaot, found all over the Holy Land, even in rural Nazareth. There are even remnants of this practice in the Gospel's nativity stories.
When the time came for their purification according to the law of Moses.
As a Jewish woman, Mary would have known all too well the rules of immersing in the mikveh.
You remove all of your clothes before you immerse yourself, and then you make sure once you go in that the water touches every surface of your body. It didn't matter whether you were lying down or sitting, you just had to be completely immersed. And when people immerse themselves in a mikveh, typically they would recite a blessing as they were purifying themselves.
This was not the only Jewish ritual that took place after Jesus was born. It was a ceremony that is no longer commemorated at Christmas, even though the Gospel of Luke faithfully records it.
On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise him, he was named Jesus.
Circumcision is one of the central rituals of Jewish identity. In a rural village during the time of Jesus, a local man would have performed the operation.
They didn't have to be a medical doctor or rabbi or anything like that, but there were people who, among other things, performed circumcisions.
The knife may have been metal or even a sharp stone, sterilized with fire.
The old way was to boil them and place them in fire and things like that for sterilization. And it's interesting that we hear of almost no episodes of problem of disease as a result of circumcision.
Extended family would have gathered together to celebrate.
And there would be a big meal served after. It was a very festive occasion.
The Gospel of Luke records one more detail of first-century Jewish life.
They brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons.
Jewish law required a sacrifice at the temple to complete Mary's purification and to give thanks for the new child.
These are things that every Jew did in that period. In fact, these are things which just weren't the common observance of Jews throughout the land.
These rituals have no place in modern Christianity, but they were vital to the early readers of the Gospels.
The Gospel of Luke is very interested in showing that Jesus and Mary go through these very Jewish rituals, circumcision for Jesus, purification for Mary, because as the Jewish Messiah, he has to be ritually taken care of.
To the Jews who first read the Nativity story, Jesus' birth was the fulfillment of prophecy. The Messiah was born in Bethlehem. A dazzling star shone overhead. Kings and shepherds alike came to pay him homage. For modern archaeologists, the birth inspires a different sense of wonder.
What's really remarkable, and maybe even the miracle of the birth story of Jesus, is that someone from that class, born in a dark and dingy setting, surrounded by animals and animal droppings, goes on to transform the entire course of Western history.
When Mary first saw her son's face, was this in her mind? Or was she enthralled by another miracle? The simple, universal miracle of life.